This is lab number 4, flood insurance rate mapping for natural disasters class. This exercise takes you through a simplified version of how FEMA or insurance companies or the National Flood Insurance Program assigns insurance premiums, insurance rates to various properties. It does resemble the way that this process is actually done in the real world. It is somewhat simplified so that you can get through it in a reasonable time, but it does demonstrate the important concept of assessing risk as well as mitigation, of which insurance is a form of mitigation, a topic that we'll talk about later in the semester. The first thing to look at is the story map that goes along with this. The link is here in the folder for this lab, and the story map has a few pages. The first one shows a location, an area with some roads, etc., with the actual flood zones for the Black Creek area shown in red and blue. The red is the 100-year flood zone, which is where generally flood insurance is required by mortgage lenders usually, sometimes by local municipalities. And blue is an extension on that. That's the 500-year flood zone, the area that would be expected to flood once in 500 years, or a 0.2% chance of flooding in any particular year. So that's the 100-year, the 1% chance in a particular year, once in 100 year recurrence interval for a flood in that red zone. Let's see. Flood mapping in the old days used to be done with paper maps, and one would draw on paper. The experts would draw flood zones on paper maps, and people would go down to the town office or the local FEMA, the most local FEMA place that they could find, and work with paper maps. We are much more advanced than that. We do have a live map, which will be able, a live digital web map, which we'll be able to use for this exercise. The worksheet that you'll be filling out, the idea is that for 12 different locations, 12 made-up house locations or hypothetical houses, we're going to determine the flood zone that it's in, either the 100-year flood zone, the 500-year flood zone, or outside of any flood zone, whether the structure has a basement, whether it has experienced any previous flooding, and then based on the flood rate sheet that's shown here, we'll be able to make an estimate of the flood cost for each particular property. These are very reasonable characteristics of a property to assess in order to estimate the cost of flood insurance. Whether it has a basement is going to have more property at risk. Often the utilities might even be in the basement, so some expensive property would be at the risk of flooding. If there's no basement, then there's less chance, that elevates the lowest part of the structure. And then previous experience with flooding is another, in addition to what zone it happens to be in, is another strong indicator of the risk of flooding. So let's begin by looking at this map, and we do have. I can hold down the left-hand mouse button and drag the map around to find different locations, and I can also use these buttons to zoom in and out or return to the default location. So zooming around and in and out. Location 1, a little bit unclear, so we'll zoom in a little bit more on location 1, and zooming in enough, it does seem that location 1 is inside of the 100-year flood zone, so that would suggest that I go right here and type in 100-year flood zone, finding out whether that particular location, this made-up house, has a basement or whether it's experienced flooding in the past. That'll be part of the mapping itself, and I can access what are called the attributes for that particular location, information about it, by clicking on the dot, and it tells me that it has no basement, but site number 1 has had flooding at a previous time. So I can go ahead and say basement, no, flooding, yes, and that's enough information at this point to be able to go and look at my flood insurance rate map, and it was in the 100-year flood zone, so it's one of these 4. I have to remind myself that there is no basement, so it would be no basement, no basement, no basement, 100-year, 100-year, and previous flooding. So by I can tune in 100-year flood zone, no basement, previous flooding. That would give me a fairly high risk and a fairly high cost of flood insurance that has a bad previous experience, and topographic or engineering analysis says it's in a 100-year flood zone. So the cost is relatively high, and my cost would be $1,200. Could proceed on to another example that I'll do another 1 or 2 more for you. We'll go to the live map. We'll look at, now I need to return to my, use the home button to return to my previous extent. And let's do maybe number 10. And I'll just, as an example, number 10 seems to be inside the blue. That's in a 500-year flood zone. So for number 10, I'll enter 500-year flood zone, and again using the map and the attributes that have been assigned, and these attributes are common. Most properties, most structures are mapped and have information attached to them. There's more information out there about properties than you know. Number 10 has no basement and has no previous experience with flooding. So even though it's in a flood zone, it's in a very the lower risk flood zone, has no basement. That's a good thing for protecting or for reducing flood damage, and it has no history. So it's both no's here. And if I look ahead, look to the chart associated, 500-year, no and no. 500-year, no basement, no previous flooding. So the fact that it's located in some flood zone where there is some known risk of flooding or some assumed risk of flooding puts the insurance rate at $582, which is much more reasonable. And we would just type in $582. And I suppose I can do one more quick example to make sure that you follow this procedure. I'll zoom back out, and we'll check out number 12. And number 12 clearly is not in any flood zone at all. It's not in any flood zone, so we can check the information. It doesn't have a basement, but it has surprisingly experienced a flood in the past. So although there is a record of a flood occurring, so although it's not actually mapped in a flood zone and insurance may not be required, there's that little black mark of some previous experience with flooding. So let's look up number 12, or write number 12, and it's not in a flood zone. It has no basement, but it has had previous flooding. So that'll be an interesting one. We'll see how the rate chart that I've prepared is not a real one. However, the values are realistic, but they are made up. So looking at site number 12, it's outside of a flood zone, no basement, but there is flooding. So it's greater than 500-year return interval, and that means outside of a flood zone. No basement, but previous flooding. So that would be a somewhat lower even cost than the other ones. And that leaves you 9 more to do yourself to submit next week, before next week in lab. or at your convenience, or at the very latest before Wednesday the 27th, the next time we meet for lab.